Holy shit. Alright, excuse me. Welcome to my channel. My name's Stephanie Bree, and today we're talking about the Nintendo GameCube. Alright, the GameCube. Everything that Nintendo should have done with the N64, but didn't. Alright. So, GameCube is one of my favorite game consoles of all time. I absolutely love the GameCube. I miss my GameCube. I can't get enough GameCube. I really wish I had a GameCube. And, oh, holy shit, it's getting late. It's after midnight. Better not eat anything in case I'm a gremlin. The GameCube is one of those game consoles that gets a mixed reputation. Nintendo fans love it and defend it. The larger gaming community used to hate on it, but are now rediscovering it and reevaluating it. And I think it's starting to find its audience again. Which is good. I hope it does. And the GameCube is not as bad as some of the other, we'll say, commercial failures in the gaming industry. So, let's talk about the GameCube. First, you got the console itself. It's a little box. A little purple lunchbox, they call it. Well, it got other colors, but it launched, it was purple. The one I had was purple. You have the little mini disc, and then you have a 4-port controller port, and 2 memory card slots, and an expansion bay on the bottom. This thing does not play DVDs like its contemporary competition, PS2 and Xbox, which was, at the time, a strike against it. Now, people erroneously and falsely claim that the GameCube wasn't online and the other two were. This is not entirely accurate. The GameCube was technically online. Nintendo did sell a network adapter for the GameCube. The problem is you could only buy it from Nintendo themselves. It wasn't sold at stores, so it was rare, hard to find, hard to get, and expensive. They didn't make a lot of games that supported it. Only like 2, I think, online games came out in the US, and then like 3 or 4 LAN-capable games came out in the US. So, yeah, it was technically internet-enabled. For all intents and purposes, it was an offline machine. But let's put that aside. Nintendo wasn't ready to commit to network play, online play, so they came up with something else on their own. Connectivity. What that meant was if you had a Game Boy Advance, and later SP or Micro, they sold a cable that plugged into the Game Boy Advance link port and connected to the GameCube through the controller port, and allowed you to do 2 things. One, it allowed you to use your GBA either as a controller or as a second screen in some cases, like the DS, the Wii U, etc. Also, it allowed for swapping content between the GameCube version of a game and the Game Boy Advance version of a game. Now, Nintendo made a big push for that connectivity early on in the GameCube's life. And so they actually did, surprisingly, get a lot of third-party companies on board initially. And so a lot of third-party games do surprisingly have connectivity functionality that you may not be aware of. The crown jewel of connectivity comes in the form of 2 games. The first one is The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures. This was a GameCube game that was a 4-player Zelda game that also had a Game Boy Advance counterpart, which was A Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, ported to the GBA with a multiplayer mode, the Four Swords Adventures mode, unlockable if you connected it to a GameCube and connected it to Four Swords Adventures. A lot of hassle for a 4-player Zelda game. The second crowning achievement, we'll say, of GameCube GBA connectivity comes in the form of a really surprising appearance of Final Fantasy on Nintendo hardware. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, which is the GameCube Game Boy Advance connectivity game I owned. I did not have Four Swords Adventures, so there's that. However, there's a downside. If you wanted to get the most out of your Crystal Chronicles game, you had to own a GameCube and the game, which was $50 for the game, $200 for the console, or $100, I guess, by the time it came out, that game came out, because they dropped the price dramatically. And then between $70 to $100 a piece for GBAs, and I believe it was $15 to $20 a piece for the link cables. So you had to have a lot of money to get the most out of the GBA connectivity, which, spoilers, you have to have even more money now because all that shit is skyrocketed in the aftermarket price. So good luck playing Crystal Chronicles or Four Swords Adventures with 4 GBAs and all the cables and 3 friends. It ain't gonna happen unless you're fucking Bill Gates. It just ain't happening. But you know, it's fun to think about. The other cool thing about the GameCube is it came with another accessory that connected to the communications port on the bottom, and that was the Game Boy Player. The Game Boy Player had a slot on the front for Game Boy cartridges, and it was compatible with Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance cartridges. This was cool because it was sort of reminiscent of the Super Game Boy on the Super NES, so it did come with, you know, backgrounds and color palettes and things like that, customizable color palettes and things like that, for your regular colorless Game Boy games, as well as allowing you to play Game Boy games with a GameCube controller, or connecting your GBA to it through the connectivity cable and using your GBA as a controller if you would prefer that method. It also had a link cable port on the front of it, so you could actually connect a GBA through the link cable to the Game Boy Player and play multiplayer Game Boy games that way. Which was pretty cool. And then there's one more thing you could do with the GameCube, which was more of an accessory for the GBA, but I spoiled it. The e-reader. But you could hook it up to your GameCube as well if you had the Game Boy Player, which I did. I got the most out of my GameCube. I was all in on GameCube. I didn't have an Xbox or a PS2. I just was 100% GameCube all the way. And GameCube was one of those rare occurrences where it had good, rock-solid third-party support, for the most part. But we do have to get into that a little bit. I say for the most part. Now, initially, Nintendo went out of their way to cut deals to entice third-party companies on the platform. So like I said previously, they did feature a lot of connectivity in their games. And occasionally they would feature Nintendo exclusive content, like Nintendo characters in the game, things like that. But then once the sales numbers dropped off, because the GameCube did not break sales charts, third-party companies decided it just wasn't worth their time to make games for the GameCube. The other thing we have to talk about is the fact that, one, the GameCube didn't have standard internet connectivity or widely adopted internet connectivity. So games that had online modes on competing consoles were offline on the GameCube. Sometimes this would be supplemented by GameCube exclusive features to make up for it. Sometimes it was a broken game that just felt incomplete because it was lacking the part of the game everybody else had. The other downfall of the GameCube is the mini discs. It didn't play DVDs. That was fine. I don't think that mattered too much in the grand scheme of things. But what did matter is you would have a game on the PS2 or the Xbox that would fill up a dual layer DVD, an 8.5 gigabyte dual layer DVD. That game ain't coming to the GameCube's 1.5 gigabyte mini disc. It ain't happening. Unless, one, it's multiple fucking discs, or two, they cut the shit out of it and just chop it down to the bare minimum. So a lot of times when a game did come to the GameCube, it was missing features or whole content sections of content compressed to shit, or it just didn't come to the GameCube at all because developers decided, why fucking bother to sell an incomplete game to an ungrateful audience. So you had that to deal with. Let's talk the controller. I will stand by the statement that the N64 controller is one of the worst controller designs ever made. I hate the Nintendo 64 controller. I've already done a video on it. You've already seen it. However, I think the GameCube controller is pretty neat. It's an interesting take on what everybody was doing at the time. It subverted expectations and gave you a controller that felt very much exclusive to Nintendo, but also reminiscent of the others enough that, you know, it still felt like you were playing the same games everybody else was playing. You know, dual analog sticks, D-pad, 4 face buttons, 2 triggers, and then a Z button. However, it was still missing a button that the other two had. They both had 4 triggers. This one had 2 triggers and a Z button, so that came out to 3 triggers. The other two systems had a select and a start button. This one just had start, so it was missing that button as well. And let's just cut to the chase. The D-pad is shit. Utter shit on the GameCube. Probably the worst D-pad ever for a game console. Ever. Worst D-pad ever. So the GameCube controller is not a phenomenal controller by any stretch of the imagination. It's better than the N64 controller, but it's not as good as the Xbox or DualShock 2 that was on the PlayStation. So it's like a step up, but not a full step. You know, it's a half step. It's better than the 64, but not as good as the others. So it's like almost there. The GameCube came with your standard array of accessories like guns, steering wheels, you know, etc. But it also had some unique stuff like a bongo controller, a microphone controller, and a chainsaw controller for Resident Evil 4, which was really cool. The GameCube didn't have as good of third-party support as the Xbox, and nowhere near as good of third-party support as the PS2, but a metric ton better than the N64. A massive improvement. So while there were gaps in the library for sure, the droughts weren't as severe on the GameCube. You could still find games to play. To that end, when the GameCube was current, when it was the current gen console that I owned at the time, I had over 60 games for the GameCube during its lifespan when it was still relevant. I was buying games every week. And I had the Game Boy player, I had the Link cable, I had a Game Boy Advance, I had the e-reader. You know, I was all in on the GameCube. Like I said, all in. I loved it. I have a list of my top 25 GameCube games already written out that's coming down the road. So I'm not going to sit here and pick the highlights from that list because that would spoil that video. But I'm going to talk about 2 games in particular that were on the GameCube that really stood out for me. The first one is Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. This was one of the first games I picked up for the GameCube, and I played the shit out of it. I 100%ed this. I unlocked everything you could unlock. I opened all the coffins. I completed all the story modes. I beat the game with all the characters on all of the different settings. I beat this game 100%. I would eventually, sidebar, get this game on Xbox and PS2. And ultimately decided I preferred the PS2 version over the others because the PS2's controller was the most suitable for playing this game. The GameCube controller, not great. The funky pattern of the faceplates makes it hard to play because your thumb naturally wants to go to where the one button should be, but instead there's like a freaking gap in between 2 buttons there where your thumb wants to go instead, so it's not very natural. The second game I want to highlight is going to confuddle some people because it wasn't exclusive to the GameCube either. This is Pac-Man World 2. I played the shit out of this game. This felt like a Nintendo game. Like it belonged on a Nintendo console, even though it was on other consoles. This game was made for Nintendo. Not made by Nintendo, but it felt like it was designed with Nintendo's philosophy in mind. And I absolutely love it. So, yes, the GameCube. I miss it. I would love to have another one someday. And a good assortment of games. But, yeah, there it is. One of Nintendo's best game consoles of all time. And unfortunately, it just didn't have the sales numbers. It couldn't compete.